Okay. Last time we looked at the first paragraph there in chapter 2, verses 1 through 7, where Paul talks about praying for all, for kings, those in authority, and others that are involved, and points out the mediatorship of Jesus. We're ready to start now by going to verse 8. Sometimes this is seen as a rather difficult passage in some ways. I really don't think it's all that difficult, but it's just something that we don't normally look at in the way that it's presented. In verse 8, beginning, he says, I desire, therefore, that the men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands without wrath and doubting. In like manner also, that the women adorn themselves in modest apparel with propriety and moderation, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly clothing, but which is proper for women professing godliness with good works. Let a man learn in silence, or let a woman learn in silence with all submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, but to be in silence. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. Nevertheless, she will be saved in childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with self-control. All right, let's look at the overall sense here for just a second. How many of you have a little title above this section that says something like men and women in the church, or the services of the church, or something like that, making it that this is behavior, talking about how we are to act as Christians when we're assembled together? Anybody have one of those kind of things? I think I see a lot of heads going up and down. Let me suggest to you that that's the problem that I see that comes about, is when one takes that for granted. Those subtitles weren't made by the Holy Spirit. They weren't given in the original writing of this. That's what men have put in and inserted in that way. And in this case, I think they have it absolutely wrong. Let's go to verse 8 starting out. Therefore, I desire, therefore, that the men pray where? Everywhere, lifting up holy hands without wrath and doubting. Now, is that talking about the conduct of men in the assembly? It's talking about the conduct of men wherever they go. Now, question. This is to happen, men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands without wrath and doubting. What is it saying about the men then? As they're praying everywhere, what are they to act like? Okay, they're to act properly. The point that's made there, lifting up holy hands without wrath and doubting. Do we have the responsibility to be holy as men only in the services? Well, no, obviously. That's a responsibility. That's why he says in every place or everywhere, lifting up holy hands without wrath and doubting. This isn't a passage that's starting out talking about conduct within the assembly of the saints. It starts out talking about how men are to act everywhere. They're to be those who are praying. They're to be those who are holy. When that talks about lifting up holy hands, is that a posture to where we ought to lift up our hands when we pray? What's the point of hands? What do they stand for in the New Testament almost always? Okay, the work that's being done, the action that is being played. Feet stand for what? Where you go, those kinds of things. And that's the idea here. You lift up holy hands of prayer. In other words, when you're praying, you don't let your prayers be encumbered by your action that has been unholy. You lift up holy hands in prayer. Or as you pray, you're doing that as one who is not just praying and acting like the devil, but you're praying to God and acting as God would have you to act without wrath and doubting. In other words, you're not in a combative spirit to try to just get a problem with everybody, But you recognize the need that is there for it to be without wrath. Why doubting? Prayer connected with doubting. James had something to say about that, didn't he? What did he say? Okay, if you pray in nothing doubting, he said. Why? Because if you're doubting, it's not worth it. It's not going to do anything because you're not having an expectation of God's ability to answer prayer and his desire to do so. Now, in like manner also that the women. What does that in like manner mean? Okay. When the women have been, or when the men are supposed to be holy, without wrath, without doubting, what are the women supposed to be acting like? They're supposed to be the same thing. That you're seen in this way as those who are godly and so forth. He said that the women adorn themselves in modest apparel. I'm not going to go into a lot of this. JT had a good lesson, or a couple of 2 or 3 lessons on this not long ago. But the idea of there to be modest apparel, women adorn themselves in modest apparel, it has to do with orderly, but ordered by what? I'm talking about you make sure your pants match your shirt. Is that the order? Okay. Orderly, how so? In order means it's under the rule of, what rule is given there? God's rule. As that which professes being Christians is the point that's made later on and on in 1 Peter chapter 3 as well. He says, with propriety and moderation, a recognition of what is proper in the sense of that which is according to holiness, or not according to shame, if you look at it in that way. Moderation, that it's to be something that is not ostentatious, whether it have to do with sexual ostentatiousness or whether it have to do with the amount of money and so forth that is cost. The next one goes into some of that, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly clothing. Obviously, that has to do with someone who's in a showing off of great wealth, or in other words, they are attracting attention by that wealth. Why not in that sort of a way? What would be the problem with that kind of thing, with just coming in with a mink stole and every kind of gold around the neck and on every finger and all of that? What would be the problem? Okay.
I heard that during that time period, it was common practice for people to show their wealth by wearing their wealth. I've heard somebody say it was like if we went and we stuck our shares of Apple and our, or whatever we had to show what you had, and it was.
You can still see the same thing today. It's a show that's there. There's also a point, though, that this is something that you haven't connected with modest apparel, with propriety and moderation. And then it says, but which is proper for women professing godliness with good works. That with a show of wealth is contrasted with that which is something that would be moderate, would be modest, would be of showing a kind of godliness about the character. Now, to be ostentatious by materialism, certainly that would violate it. But one of the things that a lot of people don't get out of this is what's obvious if you go back and read the history of the time, and might also say is very clear in the book of Revelation. It talks about silk, and that being clothed of silk in a way that is of exorbitant rates. It was a clothing that was of great amount of money, and also that which was showing. There's a book called East to Cathay by Robert Collin, and he points out, he quotes several in that time, that the silk trade had just come about in the 1st century BC in the Roman kingdom, just barely at the end of that, right about the time of Jesus' birth, a little bit before. And what they would do is they would pull that back from the trade routes as it went over towards India and some in there, and this was such expensive material that they had unwind that silk and they had rewind it into clothing much thinner. And the point's made several times that it was diaphanous or see-through. It was something that afforded no cover to the body or to the modesty of the wearer. It's the same word the Bible uses, as that quote was given in Greek. You also have others that show the same thing, that the modest clothing of the day was the more inexpensive. That which was immodest, was indeed showing of the body, was what was more money. I don't know if you women have noticed that, but that's what I see about going into stores too. You can buy a modest dress for a whole lot less than you can buy some of the stuff that's short. And in the fashion times, that's always been that which is according to fashion has been more showy and also more revealing. And that's exactly the thing that was going on at this time. So Paul has pointed out, you need to tell the men to be holy, you need to tell the women to be holy, and dress in that way as well. Anybody got any comments on that? We can go ahead.
Harry, when I read these things, and there's several places throughout the New Testament, we talk about it was the culture of the times and stuff like that, when it almost looks like it's a command as well. And we talk about it's the attitude, it's being, cultural and everything. But how does braided hair fit in with that? Because that to me, doesn't fit when we say that this verse is talking about being modest, and it's not really a command that we can't, a woman can't wear gold or pearls or expensive clothing. How does braided hair fit?
Well, I think the point is, if you look at the original, the idea is braided hair, or really that term is not in the original. If you look at most of the translations, they have with braided hair of gold or pearls or costly clothing. So the idea is, here's this hair braided with gold or pearls, other kind of jewels, and that's the showing of the intense wealth that would be there. That's not a cultural matter. Whatever is like that today, I wouldn't want my wife dressing like that, or I'd warn her of any Christian woman, don't be ostentatious of that wealth. That shows a kind of attitude that really is the very opposite of the Bible, of not calling attention to oneself and rather calling attention to one's character. Does that get to it? Think about that for a minute. Go ahead, Larry.
Wouldn't braided hair to kind of show your wealth, because it's not something a person can normally do themselves. You have to have slaves or somebody.
If you look at that,
My wife can braid her hair, so I imagine those things would probably.
yeah, you've got a lot of that that's been done. They braided in a sort of a way that was, if you look at the pictures of what you had back in that time, was usually done by women of wealth, because it usually took somebody like slaves or servants, something like that, doing those kind of things. Go ahead.
You could also go the other way and draw attention to yourself if you cut a hole in a sheet and say, well, I'm just, I'm not going to spend a penny. I'll just put a sheet on, and if I want to fix my hair, I'll just leave it. You could draw attention to yourself, not just that way, but it's that attitude, drawing attention to yourself for whatever.
Now then you would look at some other passages that would talk about the idea of a show, for instance, in Colossians chapter 2 and Colossians chapter 3, talk about the show of being, divesting yourself of anything as if that of denying yourself certain things in the flesh, that somehow that makes you more holy in and of itself. That would also be wrong in what this is talking about, but that'd be dealt with in a place like Colossians 2. I think you had a, okay.
I was going to say, I feel like I read this in a contrast to propriety and moderation, that the braided hair with gold or pearls and costly clothing is in contrast to that. So whenever I read it, it's not so much about the specifics of the gold, the specifics of the pearls and costly clothing, because that is all like relative to time and experience, so much as whenever you look down at propriety and you look down at moderation, what those words mean, it's the mindset that you have behind it and the drawing attention to yourself. So whenever you're braiding your hair and you're getting yourself ready and you're trying to look this specific way, it's more about the fact that you put more time into your hair and more time in what you look like than moderation in those things. So whenever I read it, I see it more as a contrast.
Yeah.
As
The words, though, specifically would have to do with an ostentatiousness. In other words, a wealth. That would be there. And things of that nature. What we know is that like it is today, a show of wealth was not only a problem with the drawing of attention to yourself by that caring about material things, it also went with the immodest clothing, that which was showy. And like I say, that's pointed out pretty clearly as you go over into Revelation, and when the silk trade and all of that goes down, those of wealth are the ones who suffer. And so that's clear there of the time. History showed that pretty well as well. Go over to 1 Peter 3, put that together where you have some of the same things. And there's more of an emphasis in 1 Peter 3 on the idea of not being aware of the shame, the less clothes being worn. It seems to me is the point there. Here you have both combined, the ostentatiousness and the immodesty of it as well. Anything else there? I'd go back and suggest anybody want to go back and listen to JT's sermon where he dealt with the beginning of that and what is called clothing being given at the very start in the second chapter of Genesis, and noticing how they were clothed in that way and what God called clothing. Those kind of things are good as well. That gets a background to how it was done from the beginning and then through the Bible, whether you're talking New Testament or Old Testament. You're talking about nakedness being a shame. Look at what nakedness is seen as, and you've got those. I thought he did an excellent job in pointing those out, and that's the idea here. He says, now, instead of being this as the main thing that you see in clothing, but which is proper for women professing godliness with good works. One of the points on that, I think maybe was what Matt was getting at a minute ago too, is that when you have a not but statement, it's not saying this is not at all, but mostly, or none of this and all of this, but it's usually giving a contrast in style of what the main point is. And the idea is not no braided hair at all, or you have no gold at all that you have, but the show. What is it that someone is seen by? What is the factor that is noticed about one? The idea here is if you see this woman out here living like she should properly, then what are they seeing? They see her good works, not her lack of clothing or her ostentatious clothing. That's not the point. What we're drawing attention to is the character. And that's so for both men and women, is that the character is something that ought to be there. Verse 8, notice that with the men. And now here we go in the same thing in verse 10, for women professing godliness with good works. Now, go ahead.
So the not but statement that we have there, we see that again in 12, though, when it talks about women silent. So if we're saying that the not but there, which I've always heard.
Not is the same thing. You have a different there, a may, nay conversion. This is kai. It's the word and, which is also put as but sometimes. But that's not the same construction from the Greek as what you have in the other.
Which word is different? I'm sorry.
Well, the word here that is used with regard to the women are to learn with all submission, and then going down into here, to have authority over a man, but to be in silence. That but is not a not from there. The word not there is do, and then a ada put in front of it, which is the way that that's said. In other words, you say do, to put one that says do not, you just add an ada in front of that word do. Then here, this word is kai in the original language. So it's not the same construction there at all.
Why does that have to be so confusing?
I know. I wasn't bringing that up because I didn't want to confuse with it.
I mean, but we talked about that
Yeah.
not but, you know, I read this,
Yeah.
and there's another not but right
Yeah,
after that.
yeah.
And so what
It
you
has to
said,
be the same thing. Yeah.
what you said there wouldn't have made sense there.
No.
Okay.
Not at
as
all.
long as we're in agreement.
Yeah,
with
yeah.
that.
Well, that's right. That's right. Okay. Now, when he says, let a woman learn in silence with all submission. You've got the word silence that's used over in 1 Corinthians 14. I permit not a woman to speak, but to be silent in the church. There you've got within the assembly the conduct that's pointed out. Now, that word is a word that has reference to an absolute silence. And that's why when somebody says, well, 1 Corinthians 14 then would talk about a woman's not to say anything. There are some women that have a conviction that when we're in a class, they may say something, but they wouldn't speak out in a worship service or anything, even to say amen or something. Well, there's a problem with that because that word is an absolute silence. If that's so, you shouldn't sing either, if it's to be in that way. That passage, I had asked you, without going back over there and doing a great deal of study, do the pronoun study. And what you have is let them ask their own husbands at home. Well, whoever the them is has a husband. When you back up, who is the one that's a woman that has a husband? What's under consideration is the action of the prophets and then their wife. The word women in 1 Corinthians 14, as it's first done in 33 and 34, is just the word gune. It means women or it means wife. And you got to see by context which it is. In 1 Corinthians 14, 33 and 34, it's obvious that the context is it's a wife. A wife of who? A wife of the prophet. Well, why are the wives of the prophet supposed to be absolutely silent? So that the others can ask a question of the prophet. Where could his wife ask it? At home. Let them ask at home. It's a sensible kind of thing. It's common sense as to how you would do that. That's not a passage that deals with whether women can or cannot speak at all in the nature of the assembly or making a comment or something like that. This is the passage that talks about when you would make comments or what there is to be of silence. And this isn't just in reference to what happens in the assembly. This is with regard to what happens outside of the assembly as well. So let's look at this. A woman's to learn in silence with all submission. Do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, but to be in silence. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. What kind of relationship did Adam and Eve have? They were also what? Husband and wife. And here again, you have the same thing. The woman here is the word gune. It can either have reference to a woman in general, or it can have reference to a wife. I'm going to suggest here it has clear reference to a wife. Because the point which is proper for women professing godliness with good works, let a woman learn in silence with all submission. Who is a woman in submission to? Okay. This is one of the problems I have with those who say that a woman must wear a covering, whether it's in prayer, artificial covering on her head, whether it's in prayer or certain parts of the services or various other things. They say that's a mandate that is not a custom or anything like that. It's a mandate for women because women in general are in submission to men in general. I don't believe the Bible teaches that anywhere. Go back to Acts 19, you have Rebekah being brought to Isaac. There's a male servant bringing her. She looks out across the field and said, "Who is that man?" He said, "That is your husband-to-be," or the one who you're betrothed to, as it points out. All right, then what does she do? She puts on that covering, that veil that would be there. Why? Because the point is, when you look at the Bible, that covering is not a sign that women in general are in subjection to men in general. It's a sign that a woman is in subjection to her husband. So that's all this is talking about, has to do with the idea of the subjection to her husband. That's what the old law pointed out. That's what 1 Corinthians 14 also talks about, as also says the law with regard to subjection and submission there. When the word submission is used, I'd suggest you're automatically talking about, with men and women, something that is a husband-wife relationship. Now, the obvious question is, okay, then you've just said that a woman can preach there if her husband isn't around. No, didn't say any such thing, because that's not the point being made here. This deals with the idea, let her learn in submission, is dealing with whether you're in a service or not. She is not to be in that way of challenging the authority of her husband. Go ahead.
And I think you were referring to that 1 Corinthians 14. It's two separate words. This one's more quietness. It's
Correct.
NASB, actually.
Yeah, that's what I'm looking. Yeah.
More leaning toward that leadership role as more of a submissive.
Yes, and that's the same one that's used in 1 Peter 3. I'll get to that in just a second. But the idea here is you don't do that in general, not to have that permission. I do not permit a woman to teach or have authority over a man, but to be in silence. Now, there is a question here whether this is authority over a man, anthropos, or is that talking about a husband? I don't really know, one way or the other. The fact is, that's not the general word that's usually used for a husband, but it could be also. But the point is to have that authority over a man or teach over a man. The point of all of that is you be in silence, you show your submission. Now you get to the point of what is this talking about with regard to men and women in a general point. When this is given as the reason that a woman is not to teach or to have authority over a man. Why? Because Adam was formed first, then Eve. What does that have to do with? Does that have to do with a marriage?
God's plan.
God's plan, the woman was formed first. The man was formed first, pardon me, and then the woman after that. Does that have any reference to something about the relationship of marriage itself? No, he's talking about order of creation. That would have to be a more general point with regard to that. So the idea of who is to teach and have authority in some kind of a way that's a man, not a woman. Now, let's try to take that and make an application with what we know about when men and women are in the same place with regard to teaching. case in point, Apollos. Priscilla and Aquila took him aside, and they, it points out, taught him more perfectly. What's the point with regard to that? Okay, they were both involved, so what did they do? Did they do this publicly? They did it privately. In other cases, you have someone being corrected publicly. Peter, for instance. Who corrected him publicly? Well, why would that be right? Because that's the place of a man there. You go into other passages and you see that contrast being made between the place of a woman and the place of a man in a general way. That's not referred to as submission or subjection. Submission and subjection, as far as I can understand the scripture, has to do with the responsibility of a wife towards her husband, not towards men in general. With regard to a place, you're talking about, God has given by order of creation a place for men to be one who is not under the authority, but he is to be one exercising that in some sort of a public sense. And I don't think that has reference to anything about just the worship service. That's in a general point. I'd have a problem with a woman being one who was a president, for instance, or, well, you've got the vice president for that matter. But it's a general point. It's not a point with regard to that which is of a husband-wife relationship. Go ahead.
I hate to be that guy again. I do not forbid a woman to teach or have authority over a man. In 1 Corinthians 11, it talks about women who prophesied. If they were prophesying, were they teaching?
Yes, but where? In the public? Always within the public of 1 Corinthians 14, you had the one who was speaking in tongues, or the prophet is the masculine ending. The only place you find a prophetess speaking is outside of that. Philip's daughters, his virgin daughters, were prophetesses. And that was aside, a kind of a statement that was not part of the assembly or a general speaking to men. It was something where aside they made this statement to Paul.
I was talking about 1 Corinthians 11, verses 5 and 6, right in there, where it talks about it. Because you mentioned head coverings, and I turned over there.
Yeah, and that has to do with the man and woman there, very clearly husband-wife. That's the point with regard to the covering that you see going all the way back to Genesis 19. That was what a woman did in the presence of her husband to show you she was in submission to him. Go ahead.
Aquila and Priscilla followed that pattern of taking Apollos to
Right.
the side, and they both, are understood to have taught together in a way where she didn't have the authority over
That's
that
right.
scenario. So that would match that pattern that you were talking about.
That would be that sense of the pattern. Go ahead.
So what, if anything, does this have to do with the business environment?
With regard to the business environment, while I don't think that's showing something about character of godliness, I'd have a problem with someone getting in that place to where they're at the authority over everyone else, simply because I'm not sure about that. I'm not going to say that that would absolutely fit in here. I'm going to be at a point where, for my own, I wouldn't do it. But I'm not certain that there is the evidence here to show that applies to a business relationship in functioning like that. But when you're in overall rule, like politics would be, there would be something I'd have a problem with. I think there's enough there that that's going beyond the scope of what the man is formed first, then the woman. When you're talking about a whole nation that's under, I'd have some problems. I love Margaret Thatcher. I hate to take that position. But that's what I would do, what I'd suggest. Go ahead.
Usually the point where Deborah gets thrown in, and how that worked, which it did, which I don't understand, but it did, that she had authority.
But who did she seek out first?
Exactly.
Barak, to be the one that was there, so that he was giving a front to that. Plus the fact that God even tells the Israelites at that point, the reason he chose her is to say, look, I'm going to do this even through the woman, which was seen by the world as a matter that was shameful if you had a woman directing the army.
The men weren't doing what they were supposed to, so it
They were
was
cowardly.
shown in a way to reprimand,
Correct.
cause shame to those who weren't doing what they were supposed
Right. Draws attention to the extreme cowardice of the men in that army at that time. All right. I kind of wondered whether we would get all the way through with this. Go ahead.
Okay, so I got two quick questions. So family Bible lesson. So you have a husband and a wife and some kids, us. I'll just use us. So is a wife to not speak up in a nightly family Bible lesson and only the husband should speak? That's the first one.
There's no authority shown in that.
So
And this is the word showing that the word silence here, as pointed out, is a word that's not with regard to absolute silence. This is the meekness and silence, like in 1 Peter chapter
that
3.
would be an okay.
Relative, yes.
Okay, and then the next thing is, well, I guess it kind of answers, so let's say father is gone, you have a son who's been baptized, can mother still do nightly Bible lessons, or does that shift there because you have a baptized male?
I see nothing about the matter of a baptized male making them a man.
Okay,
Bible doesn't teach that. There may be some judgment that we would say, well, beyond this age, I wouldn't do that. But as far as baptism, it does not make adult in anything that I can see.
right.
Anybody else there? Did we open up too much of a can of worms here?
Well, if that's the case, then obviously there's got to be some judgment, because if a man is married, then he's obviously taken a position of authority over the family, and he is the
Correct.
man. But if he's 45 years old and has never been married, it doesn't make him a boy. So
Yeah, that's
there's
correct.
some judgment here to be
Right.
made.
All I'm pointing out is baptism does not make that delineation. Baptism is a delineation between one who's lost in sin and one who is forgiven. There's nothing I see about whether that makes a man or not. That's another issue altogether. Go ahead.
Examples of whole families being baptized, like in Acts 10, so that wouldn't dissolve the family relationship.
Yeah, well, whatever, it doesn't say anything about it. That's where I feel comfortable to leave it. We don't assume on the silence. It just says nothing about that at all. Jason, you had something.
It's to me, it is inferred that Eunice and Lois had a part in teaching Timothy to a point. There's not any specifics, but you can draw some conclusions from that relationship. It didn't mention a man in that relationship. It mentioned his mother and grandmother and Timothy, their faith transferred to him. How did that get transferred? Stop.
Clearly have it with Moses and his mother and some others as well. All right, anything else there? I wanted to get to this last little part. She shall be saved in childbearing. I'm not going to get that because we have nowhere close to the time to deal with that. But sometimes I'll hear people, what does that mean? And so come back next week and we'll deal with that, okay? I don't think it's all that difficult, so it won't take us a lot of time. And then we'll start getting into chapter 3 after we answer some of the questions from chapter 2, have those finished out. We'll review some of that, and then get into chapter 3, where it's the qualification of elders, which I know nobody will have a question about at all, because that's all very simple, so no problem. I know there will be some. So anyway, we'll talk about that next time, Lord willing.